Great, thank you, everybody. As our speakers get seated here, it's really interesting to have this What Price Populism as our first breakout session, our panel session here, because a lot of the themes that we're going to touch on here in this panel were actually brought up by our keynote speaker and earlier on by the chief executive, et cetera. The title of this is What Price Populism. I think what we're going to get into here as we start this discussion is, first of all, we have to define exactly what we mean by populism. Does it mean the same thing here in Hong Kong as it means in the rest of Asia, as it means perhaps in Europe, or what it means in the United States? Different people may define populism differently. And we also have to ask the question, is populism always a negative thing? Is there such a thing as a benign form of populism, or is it only dangerous when it's weaponized by certain politicians who know how to use populism for their own benefits? Is populism really a rejection of globalization, as has been suggested here, or is it simply a cry for relief by those who might have been left out of globalization? Is populism really a rejection of some of the elites and some of the institutions that have been governing our lives for a long time, including government institutions, business institutions, and including the media that I'm familiar with? Is this simply a rejection of these institutions that people feel has not benefited them? I think we've got a really interesting panel here to discuss all of these things and put some perspective on it. I'm going to ask the speakers just for their opening remarks to come up here to the podium, and then after that we'll sit and exchange some views among ourselves, and then invite all of you to get involved as well. I think we're going to start with Andrew Sheng, who's going to come at it from, he's our distinguished fellow from the AsiaGlobal Institute. He's going to give us some perspective, and then we're going to move on to Marc Levitt, who's coming to us from the United States with his perspective, and he's also a AsiaGlobal fellow here at the AsiaGlobal Institute. And then we'll have, after that, Professor Fung will come and wrap it up for us. I'm going to be a pretty strict timekeeper, so we get out on time. I'm going to hope to have all of you please keep your remarks to about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll speak among ourselves for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please, if you hear me tapping my finger, that means try to wrap it up. Let's start with Andrew.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be back here, and I particularly want to thank Vice Chancellor for taking AGI to new heights. And I'm very pleased that I'm not in Lok Yew Hall to take an exam. But very quickly, it's fantastic to be with Victor and William and Professor Chen Zhiwu and Mike, and to say very quickly about these issues, which I think Keith has highlighted. Both C. Carrie Lam and Mike has painted the big picture. Populism is defined, if I may just very quickly start on this, as the movement that is essentially anti-establishment, anti the elites that run the place. In another fellow Nobel laureate, Joe Stiglitz, point 1% of the 1% for the 1%. And how are we going to deal with this? Now, I don't want to get into why populism occurs. I think we know that already. I think Mike has already pointed this out, the anger that has been built into this. I want to really focus on what the hell can we do about this. And since leaving Fung Global Institute, I've gone back to ASEAN and spending time, and to me, these last few years, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. And the problem, the old establishment view was, sorry to say this, location, location, location. If globally you're in the right place, you can't go wrong. But with technology and total globalization, the job location is now transformed. If those of you, I highly recommend you read Wired Magazine, the article on what Adidas is doing to instant manufacturing tailored for the consumer in one day, scale, scope, and speed. That means this is done in Germany, not in the cheap labor countries of Asia were in an existential crisis. I mean, the model that we have grown on in Asia is seriously threatened by not just globalization, because the insecurity of jobs, if not handled properly, we have seen in terrorism around, in many parts of Middle East and Asia. So the anger is there. What can we do about it? And I agree with Mike 100%. We cannot slow down productivity and technology. Now, the issue of technology in the populism issue is very straightforward, in my view. Number one, populism could not have spread so fast, and if I may say, so extremely, without social media technology. That, the genie is out of the box. And there are ways to handle this, as we know, and I think President Trump is very good at using these means to transmit his populist messages. That's only one example. But those of you who watch what is happening in the religious front, the fundamentalist front, that is really scary. But I really want to address the issue of technology on job creation and all this, because that, as I said, is the first major thought. And to me, there are two wings to populism, the left and the right. And anthropologist David Graeber, who those of you have read his books on debt, the first 5,000 years, which is the problem of, if I may say so, fundamental capitalism, that it is debt-driven. The problem since the 1990s is a huge debt creation. The world has printed more money, more debt than ever before. His insight into this is very good. He says that the left wing of this populist thinking has no solution to the way things are moving. That means they have no solution to bureaucracies. Because if we want to implement any policy, the bureaucracy is right in the middle. And so, last night, with those of you who listened to CY talking about B2B, C2C, etc., people tend to forget between B to B is a middle G. The government is right in the middle. Between C to C is also G. And if the G doesn't work, the market doesn't work. And a lot of the problems of the market is basically state failure. And if the left keeps on insisting we've got to do more welfarism, we've got to spend more, but we don't deal with the bureaucracy right in the middle, the inability for government to deliver everything to restore trust. It's not the political level, it's the bureaucratic level, and we're in deep trouble. The right has a very simple story. The right just says, just get rid of government, just minimize government, and the market will take care of itself. Well, the market hasn't taken care of all the inclusivity issues that we need to be concerned about. So in the work that I have been working, and I've been following Mike and Joe Stiglitz, and some of you may know there is a global commission on, the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, which Mike and Joe co-chairs. I have been struck, but it's not the theory issue. The real issue before us is how do we restore trust, and how do we get governments to work better to restore trust. And that, actually, it struck me, is the Westphalian problem. We are still thinking about the world in nation-states of Westphalia, okay, without understanding that the actual delivery of services is at the city level. So actually, in my view, it's not the theory. We will, the theory has failed us. I mean, a lot of the social theory, economic theory, political theory has failed us because we are, because we've got a real mess. The real issue is how do we deliver all the things that Mike has talked about and Carrie has talked about, and deliver it away in a clean level. And in my view, the Asian story is a good one, because China and India has demonstrated that if you deliver good services at the city level, the nation, and you allow cities to compete with each other, the solution is much better than you think. And that's why I think, India is in a better shape. Parts of ASEAN, in fact, is growing at 7+%. Malaysia just announced just over 6% growth. So we're in a good growth zone. We have the formula to do this. Hong Kong is a great place to get this done. So I'm looking forward to have a good discussion on these issues. Thank you very much indeed, Keith.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. Job creation and the rise of social media were 2 points I thought were very interesting in that. I think we might hear a different perspective now. Marc Levitt worked on the Obama campaign in 2008 and also on the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. So let's hear what he has to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Keith. Thanks to Victor, thanks to Andrew, and thanks to the AsiaGlobal Institute that has been so generous in their support of the fellows over the course of the last 3 months. It's been a really wonderful experience, and I hope that the things that I have to say do honor to the program. Recognizing that populisms differ by region, I'm going to start with a story about the populist crisis in the United States to try to highlight some transnational themes. I'll then offer a defense of populism, and then if I haven't gotten the shepherd's hook from Keith, I'll share my views on how to handle what I'll call weaponized populism, and I'll close with views on the global trade regime as it relates to populism. First, the story of crisis. The television show The Walking Dead features a post-apocalyptic zombie plague overtaking the United States. The show happens to be particularly popular among white, rural Americans, heavily overlapping with Donald Trump's base. The Trump campaign even advertised on the show, seeking to exploit its connection to anti-immigrant viewers. I don't know if the show's anti-immigrant themes are what drew those viewers in, but I can say from observation that the show resembles their lived experience in a truly unexpected way. While I worked for Bernie Sanders in Vermont, our office overlooked City Hall Park. A farmer's market every now and then would lend that park a bit of life, but most of the time it was a hangout for heroin addicts. Over the border in rural New Hampshire, the heroin addicts and opioid addicts were even more noticeable. They were covered in welts, with their eyelids barely hung open. They grunted and shuffled like zombies through New Hampshire's towns, and this scene repeated itself through rural America. We now understand a bit more about how the opioid crisis began and its connection to elite failure. Doctors worked with pharmaceutical companies and weak regulators to push waves of prescription opioids into the market. When paths to those drugs closed or became too expensive, addicted patients turned to street heroin and to fentanyl. In 2016, about 50,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses, and in the run-up to the election, white rural voters were surrounded by the Walking Dead. Elites, doctors, corporate America, and regulators were largely to blame. And if you pair this tableau with concentrated economic dislocation, government shutdowns, bureaucratic capture, a housing bust, and soaring bank profits, and the table was set for weaponized populism. Voters facing these crises weren't all dagger-eyed racists, though some certainly were. Many of them were, however, realists. They were reacting to a broken social compact by seeking revolutionary change. It didn't matter to them that Trump was an elite. He channeled and understood the public's rejection of elite norms. It didn't matter at all that he lied openly. In lying openly, he pulled the veil back on politicians who trafficked in partial truths and false promises while simply hoping his voters wouldn't notice. At least, these voters might say, Trump was honest about it. Against this bleak background, it helps to distinguish weaponized populism from a more benign populism, as I believe populism can be a force for good. In a system that depends on popular legitimacy, seekers of top office face a structurally salient fact when deciding how to make their appeals. There simply are more regular people than there are of elites. To use the US again as an example, many, if not most, presidents and candidates are populist crusaders. Teddy Roosevelt had his malefactors of great wealth. FDR welcomed elite hatred. Reagan blamed government bureaucrats. Obama pushed back at fat cat bankers. And in each case, the populists embodied Galbraith's countervailing power, shaping the political debate and creating an oppositional balance. Widening the application of Galbraith, populists seized their moments to shatter conventional wisdom about the politically possible. Elites had all but written off single-payer health care until Bernie Sanders brought it back into vogue. Bernie also gave voice to concerns that major parties were themselves the vanguard of oligarchy. Populism then was the vehicle for more incisive critique and broader policy options. Populism will continue to be a feature of political campaigns. In fact, I consciously leveraged it when I constructed events for Obama and Bernie. At most campaign events for those candidates, you may have seen, we constructed the event so that there was a cheering crowd of, so to speak, regular people behind the candidates. And it's pretty awkward, both for the candidate and for the audience, to be shaped this way. But the reason that we did that is to convey the message via that imagery that other voters out there in the TV-watching audience should support this candidate because they have the popular legitimacy that should lend them that support. They were, so to speak, of the people. Obviously, things get bad when populism is weaponized, but even exploiting racial division isn't necessarily new. Brexit was preceded by Nixon's Southern strategy, which was preceded by European ethno-nationalism, and so on. Despite our limited understanding of the phenomenon, I'll offer a couple of thoughts on how to address it. First, we need to address the weaponized populists themselves, not just root causes. And what that means is building institutional resilience. Populism is inseparable from its practitioners. Alexander Hamilton warned us about unruly tyrants. Max Weber said that charismatic figures would win devotional followings by exploiting social rupture. And if we want to get Marxist about it, conditions of rupture are inevitable in capitalist societies. At the risk of oversimplification, in the absence of strong institutions, countries like Venezuela and the Philippines have suffered mightily under populist leaders. Some have suggested that an Asian solution may be to put in place strong leadership and hope that they don't overplay their hand. Yet I think history and theory suggest that prayer isn't enough. If elite capture terminally threatens institutional effectiveness, one despairs of a solution to the inevitable would-be tyrant. Meanwhile, I am a cautious optimist that certain American institutions, vibrant courts, a tenacious media, free-ish congressional and state elections, will make the Trump phenomenon look very different a year from now. Second, the truth is the weaponized populist's greatest enemy, and we ought to pursue whatever means are available to assert the primacy of truth in human affairs. The problem, of course, is not the availability of truth, but whether or not people's motivated reasoning will allow them to believe it. It's difficult to persuade a person that global trade lowered prices and technology took their job. It's easier to blame liberals and immigrants. So far, neither state nor free market has supplied good answers to how we fight information silos and fake news. The U.S. conceit is to hope that a free press and the courts can at least try to arbitrate what's true. If the bottom falls out for either of those institutions, the U.S. experiment may be irreparably harmed. I agree with those who say that redistribution is prudent and justified. Yet one has the sense that counter-cyclical policy alone can't meet human needs under threat from technology. Respect of one's peers, feelings of competence, community, and inclusion. Indeed, if humiliation, and as we've seen, humiliation may be a big part of this, is a component of weaponized populism, money and retraining may just worsen the problem. I'll close with a comment about the connection between global trade and populism. I certainly don't advocate for a weakening of global trade ties. I think that that's lose-lose. But I do have sympathy for the view that developed societies suffering under weaponized populism need to address social ills from institutional failures and the encroachment of technology before they can expand free trade regimes. I say this for reasons of political economy rather than economics. Advocating for more free trade at this juncture will hand the populist a rhetorical weapon to wield against us and exploit the worst among us. Brexit and Trump could be a prelude. What's next could be an even greater threat to global trade ties. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. That was very, very interesting. You know, we've heard two really different views now, so I think, as always, we're going to have to rely on Victor to come up here and put everything in the context and perspective for us. So, Victor, help us out.
Well, I don't know about that comment. Look, I think we really are addressing today the most important issue that we're facing in the world today. Whether you're from developed countries or developing countries, whether you're from the business sector or government or just really from among the people. You know, this issue of rising protectionism, populism, I think is the issue, and rising inequality. I think the issue has already been crystallized, you know, by the various, by Mike's very, very significant speech, by the comments of my fellow panelists, and even the Q&A that was taking place in this hall. So let me just add my own view on the things that you've already, on the agenda that you've already put in front of us. First, you know, this idea of what is the extent of populism in the West versus the East. You know, I think, Marc, you really gave a very good and deep thought about that particular point. I really have very little doubt that the populism has really been on the rise in the developed economies, and it's actually a serious problem, and it must be addressed, and it's a driving force for Brexit, for Trump, and so on. You know, I think, let me just quote you a couple numbers from the Pew Global Survey. Really, this is a pretty big survey. The Europeans and Americans are overwhelmingly pessimistic about the future. Only 28% of EUs and 32% of Americans interviewed think that they will be better off than their parents. By contrast, 51% of Asians think so. 44% of Americans think that life today is worse than 50 years ago. And only 36% think it's going to be better. 49% of Americans think that global engagement threatens jobs and lowers wages. Chinese and Indians, by contrast, are generally very optimistic about the future. 82% of Chinese and 72% of Indians think that their children will be better off. So in my mind, that really brings out the fact that this problem that we're facing is absolutely global, but it's absolutely more severe in the West than we are facing here in Asia. And this is probably as good a time for us in Asia to be bringing different Asian perspectives and potential solutions to this problem. Lest it happens to us, that's the first issue. The second is, can we contribute to the global debate on solutions to this problem? So I think it's really on that, I'd like to just re-emphasize the mission of the AGI and the idea that on critical issues like this, it is time to really bring different Asian perspectives to these very serious global issues. Now, the second thing I like to say is this concept of jobs is absolutely key. You know, Andrew, I have absolutely, you and I have talked about this copiously. You know, it's jobs, jobs, and jobs. But the idea of trading off further improvements in technology and productivity for the sake of jobs, I think really has to be put in perspective. You really got to start asking yourself, you know, I still have a fundamental belief, and maybe somebody is going to shake that soon, that the ultimate system is still the man-machine system. Now, we're going to hear from other speakers that may tell me otherwise, and I need to confront the evidence, if that's the way to put it. But I still think we need to come up with new solutions that would actually give the role for jobs at the same time is not to impede technological and productivity and other improvements to the human conditions. Now, if you dig deeper into just technology and think on jobs and so on, and Mike Spence and I have had many dialogues on this particular point, you know, I think I accept the view that technology actually will be creating new jobs, absolutely, but will also be destroying jobs in the old economies. But net, it's going to be a net increase of jobs. You're going to actually have different types of jobs and so on. I think it took me a while, frankly, to come to that conclusion, that the technological process will be a net increase in jobs. You've got to think through all the ways in which jobs could be increased, all the new consumer demands, et cetera, that you can satisfy, and then what the impact is on the old economy and the destruction of jobs in the old economy, and come up with a conclusion there'll be a net increase. But let's say I even accept that point. I accept that there will be a net increase. But to get from here to there is a huge issue. It is a huge issue in retraining, in my mind, and also looking at the nature of our whole education system. Are we really educating our people that are fit for purpose for the new economy? So you assume that the net is good, the net increase in jobs, but how are you going to get people that are in existing jobs over there to do the new jobs? I think we need a massive innovation in education, in retraining, in also the new people that are coming into the workforce. Are we really still targeting them for the old jobs, or are we targeting them for the new jobs? I think that to me is at least my initial conclusion. And somebody will tell me that's a very optimistic conclusion, but I'm a perennial optimist. But even an optimist will have to say that there's a massive challenge in re-education. Okay, so I think that's the first job. The second thing I would say is I think it's beholden now on the business sector. By the way, Andrew, I completely agree with you about the role of, you know, it's not B to C, it's B to G to C. It's not B to B, it's B to G to B. You know, the role of government is going to be completely examined, both positive and negative. But I think there's a really an important point for us in the business world to think about at the business level, how do we make this man-machine system work in the optimal way? And I can really capsulize that in our field, which is global supply chains. You know, if you go back to history, global supply chains 1.0, the original thing, would be vertically operated companies and larger and just smaller and smaller number of multinationals that are vertically integrated that get bigger and bigger. Now, until Mr. Deng Xiaoping opened up China and we started this model of radical outsourcing and the global supply chain 2.0, which has been driving the world in the last 35 years. And that actually is the creator of a lot of employment on a global basis. Because now, because of the fragmentation of the supply chain, every piece of the supply chain can be contracted out to a developing economy, and they can concentrate on a niche and then fit into the global system, and thereby creating jobs, exporting of labor, et cetera, in a good way, and then actually creating economic pathways for economic growth. We're now facing another disruption, which is the global supply chain 3.0, where technological change at the consumer level is playing havoc to that whole equation. Now, the thing that we need to remember here is, I think we need to come up with new supply chain, global supply chain models at the firm level that would translate globally into, at the national and multinational level, multilateral level, on how to actually have technological progress that would enable the consumer, enable the supply chain to work much faster and completely digitized, and at the same time, not destroy employment. So really, it's how to actually reconcile employment, especially in the developing economies with the needs of the global supply chain. If one of the technological giants, give me an idea that I can create a factory that will make T-shirts for $1 a piece, untouched by human hands, and we can do the whole thing in America, I'm not so sure that's good news or bad news. I'm not sure. People tend to applaud that as technological progress. But if you think through the consequence, but are we going to stop that? No, absolutely not. So how do you reconcile that with the need for employment in Bangladesh? So I think that to me is the global challenge that the business world has to face, and in the conglomeration of the business world, and the solutions that we apply to at the firm level, and really the creation of the global supply chain 3.0, the next iteration that incorporates global digitalization of the global supply chain with employment is going to be the real challenge. So let me wrap up by saying I think there are really two real issues. One is, as I said, fundamentally, it's all about human talent. And how do you actually upgrade and train and retrain human talent for this new world? The second one, I think, is communication. The idea that let's not blame this whole thing on globalization and stop globalization, because I think the solutions that we're looking for ultimately, well, first of all, if you really want to apportion the blame, I've looked at studies in which maybe the loss of jobs, especially in the West, is probably 10 to 20% due to cross-border trade, globalization in the populist press. About 80% is actually due to technological change within the countries, within America, that's been affecting the loss of jobs. So let's first of all put the thing in perspective from that standpoint. If you stop globalization in the sense that people define it, stop trade, protectionism, et cetera, close the borders, you're still going to have a huge problem. In fact, the solution comes in a continued and even more open global system in which we can actually encourage upward mobility in the society on a cross-border basis, on a cross-border basis. If you look back to the last 35 years and the globalization, the global supply chains 2.0, it was built on the basis of a multilateral system that worked and that allowed pieces of the supply chain to be subcontracted to different developing economies and really flowed in a global supply chain system. If we stop that and we stop the cross-border innovation, I think we're in very serious trouble. So you've got to really then communicate and, first of all, describe the problem, and second, really come up with the appropriate solution. And I'm really, all I've done is frame the issue. I have no solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Hope you can all hear me. That was terrific. Thank you for summing that all up. We're going to stay seated for this portion and just have a few questions here for our panelists, and then please start thinking of your questions so you can jump in as well. Can I start, Andrew, with you? Can I just ask you to respond just to what Marc said earlier, which is simply that not all populism is bad populism, that in fact, if you look at U.S. history, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, even Barack Obama, they all made populist appeals. So what we should be worried about is when populism gets twisted or weaponized by people, but populism itself actually can help shape the debate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I 100% agree, because populism in every country is very different. You can't generalize this, right? That's the issue here. I mean, populism in the West is very different from the populism in the East. In parts of Asia, we're dealing with religious fundamentalism. And that's very populist, right? We're dealing with ethnic issues, which is also very, very populist. So that's why I didn't want to go into the theory of this. By the way, I've come to the conclusion that the fundamental difference between Asia and the advanced countries, put it this way, is theory. actually Asians are more practical. You know, forget the theory, let's just get on to it, right? And let's face it, there are no solutions to this because there are no grand solutions to all this problem. The grand solution was the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus on the ground failed. And it failed not only in emerging markets, it's now failing in the advanced economies, right? So I think the practice part is very important. And I want to use this opportunity, if I may, talk about these differences on why populism hasn't arisen in certain parts of Asia. Everybody here in Hong Kong is very familiar with how in China today, in literally over maybe the next 24 months, payment is by phone. That is the staggering part about China. But those of you who've been to Jakarta, the other area where technology has changed and created jobs is a phenomenon called Gojek. How many people have heard of Gojek? Yeah, very small. But you know, Gojek transformed 250,000 unemployed youths on motorbikes on goods and service delivery in Jakarta, and now throughout Indonesia. And basically the same thing is the mobile phone app that allows you to do this. Now, the Uber problem is always a trust issue, right? The platform matches supply and demand, but it's a trust issue. But Gojek has used the kind of a Uber platform technology for young male and female to drive and suddenly solve a lot of identity problems. You know, if you're on a motorbike, you know, and if you're very conscious about gender issues, you don't want a woman sitting hugging a stranger on a motorbike. So guess what happened? They created women Gojek drivers for women. And the other area which has created a job, you will laugh at this, is Go Massage. And it's not CD or whatever it is genuine families who, through this Gojek application, is able to summon genuine traditional massage people to come to their houses to deliver a service, creating jobs for people. So all of a sudden, I think, you know, this experimentation with technology in Asia has now created jobs which we never dreamt about. And the reason is actually the government allowed it, right? If the vested interest, we've seen this in many countries, if the vested interest blocks this technology, it doesn't advance, it doesn't solve the problem, giving rise to populist anger. So, you know, I'm very hopeful. I totally agree with Victor. You know, the jobs will be created in ways that we have not dreamt about, right? But you cannot do this through theory. The textbook won't teach you anymore where the jobs are going to be created. It's going to be by pure experimentation.
Can I add just one point?
Please.
And that really is a fantastic example of where we think, where I think we should be heading. But it really requires innovation. Innovation in a generic sense, not just dependent on technology, but maybe some use of technology, but innovative models. And then the thing I want to bring in, though, is it's great for Indonesia, but won't it be even better if it was all ASEAN and all Asia? So I think the scaling up, especially in today's technological world, you need a globalized world. That's the point I want to get in here. If you are restricting the world to a series of small home markets, even the big ones are not big enough. You need scale. And that's how jobs could be created cross-border. That's why I keep using the word cross-border innovation, cross-border upward mobility, cross-border upward mobility. And I think that's very important. And that's why we cannot stop the progress of globalization and the development of a good multilateral system.
Yeah, very interesting points. You know, I was struck, Victor, when you were speaking about how technology destroys jobs but then creates jobs. I was thinking, you know, I spent 30 years in print newspapers working for the Washington Post. The newspaper industry, in print at least, has been decimated. but there are now more outlets for journalists and probably more journalists than ever before. So I tell my journalism students here at HKU, some of whom I think are up in the balcony, you know, when I graduated from university, I got out and looked for a job. These days, they're going to have to graduate and create a job, which they can do because we teach digital skills and digital entrepreneurship skills. They'll be building their own websites. That raises a question for you, Marc. I mean, I was going to ask, you know, during the campaign, the last several campaigns, there seemed to be people on both sides trying to tell Americans that the old jobs can come back. If you just do things like, don't vote for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we can bring your factory jobs back. Should we be doing what we're doing in the media industry, creating new jobs or new industries instead of making people believe that the old jobs can come back?
I mean, absolutely. You know, that raises a strong point. I mean, 2004, I think, was sort of the peak of this. You know, with John Kerry's campaign, and you know, obviously there was this 2016. Trump promised everybody that the coal mining jobs were going to be coming back and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, there's no question that some level of honesty among politicians would help on this score, and I don't know that necessarily the demagoguery surrounding trade evades that. Which is to say, like I said, I think Donald Trump's hammering on this theme. It's not about trade per se, but it's about a basket of issues that are associated with elites. And there is an honesty associated with just attacking that entire group that has failed us, right? And so, yes, on sort of a nitpicky level, being trade protectionist is deeply problematic, and obviously, these things aren't going to bring the jobs back. But the American electorate happens to be actually pretty good at figuring out what lies are, and that's part of what has led to this crisis in the first place. So I don't think anybody's really fooled by that necessarily. But I think that long term, that trade in terms of how it gets presented to the electorate is going to be a casualty to some degree of its association with sort of a larger group of issues that are associated with elites. Honesty on that point may not rescue it, and we'll just have to see how that goes.
Thank you. And Victor, a question for you. When I look at China, and I'm trying to think of in your words, using Asia as solutions that others might look to. When I look to China, I see it has a lot of bordering countries, borders Vietnam, for example, borders Laos. Should we be, when Western countries come here and look to invest or do business, should they be not looking at countries per se, but looking at regions? Should they be looking to say, let's build a car, maybe Cambodia can do this part, Vietnam can do another part, we'll assemble it in China? Is that the way we should be looking? Is the nation-state idea old-fashioned?
Without doubt whatsoever. I think, Heath, you really hit the nail on the head. In fact, the global supply chain 2.0 that we had for the last 35 years was, in fact, a total radical outsourcing. And taking the whole supply chain and exploding it into every piece and giving the piece to best in class to a different factory, very possibly in a different country, and then reassembling it using technology. In the past was internet. But so that's exactly the way that we should be thinking about it. But I also like to just respond to one point that you really touch on, which really strikes a tremendous nerve with me. I think the role of education should not be to train our students for a particular job, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, because those jobs, frankly, may or may not exist by the time our students get into the job market. We should really be training them to create their own jobs, because that frontier is going to be evolving very rapidly. How do you train them to create their own jobs? And I think that's really the whole issue. I think, I've been a kind of professor myself, so I kind of know a little bit, what happens in the thinking in the profession. I think that has to be totally revolutionized.
Please, Andrew, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Victor. Education is the area, but we have a fundamental bureaucratic problem. In tech savvy, the students are better than the professors. It's a sore point, right? And so actually, I went to Silicon Valley. I discovered that 40% of the jobs are non-graduates. And the startups don't hire people on whether they graduate from Ivy League A or B or C. They say, what have you done? If you've done this startup and you worked on this application, you're hired. You're much needed. So actually, the biggest disruption, in my view, that's why I focus on the bureaucracy. The biggest disruption is actually in every field, including education. And if you're going to do the traditional top-down trying to reform, where the warlords of university departments or the schools of government education ministries, you're going to fight the next 10 years over education reform, which won't succeed. Which is why, your point, Keith, about regionalism is very interesting. And why I wanted to stress that the action will be at the city level or at the local level, no longer at the Westphalian central level. Because what is really blocking reform in all these regional issues that you talk about, not because the center or the federal government wants to do things, is that the local government says, there's nothing in it for me. And if you want that road right through my province or my city, forget it. If I don't get a stake, I won't do this. So One Belt, One Road or any regional type programs cannot succeed without addressing local issues.
While you have the mic, can I ask you to just follow up on one point that kind of came up, education. We know that a lot of students from this part of the world go to the West and do very well because they do very well on standardized tests. But do you see any education system in the region here that's doing well in the innovation, critical thinking area? And where would that be?
A lot of students these days are very good at fulfilling, IQ metric tests. That actually tells me nothing, to tell the truth. Because that's not education, in my view. That's only fulfilling digits. Some countries are very proud they do much better on the World Bank doing business in the indices. They're just fixing the indices. They're not fixing the problem on the ground. So in my view, there is no good example of this. I think Singapore has done a lot in this area. But if you really look at different pockets of education, some of the surprising superstars that are emerging in innovation have come from non-elite universities.
And Marc, can I ask you, well, let me ask you a question and then please follow up on that. President Obama got in trouble when he was running in 2012 for re-election when he said everybody should go to university. And people said, how dare, that's so elitist. Some people don't need to go to university. How do you put this in perspective? How do we train people to create these jobs if we still have people saying it's elitist to think that people should get a 4-year undergraduate degree?
Yeah, well, I can't. I also can't defend everything President Obama said. I think that there's a certain sense in which it is elitist, and there's a certain sense in which it's egalitarian. And, so I think that, those who were tagging him for being elitist were frankly just taking advantage of a rhetorical opportunity because, extending university education or college education to as many people as possible is also an egalitarian goal as well as it is an elite goal. I would respond also to this question of, education and local service provision, which are both extraordinarily important, as Victor and Andrew mentioned. But one thing that I would identify, at least, from a political economy perspective within the United States, is that improved educational systems and improved service provision at the local level, these are largely going to be government services. And I would identify that the people who are sort of most staunch proponents of free trade regimes, the people who are most staunch proponents of free markets, are also the people who are advocating for a reduction in tax revenue in the United States. And so you have this push-pull where, on the one hand, yes, we absolutely need more education, we need more local tax provision, local service provision. But you know, when the actual legislation comes out of Congress, and when the actual legislation comes out of state governments, those same people are asking for the conditions to be eliminated that would allow for that service provision. I just think it's sort of a difficult, challenging irony as you manage the sort of slow growth era in the United States.
Yeah. And can I just ask one question kind of as a follow-up to that? And please, both of you answer, and then after this, we're going to get to your questions from the audience. I'm curious, how do you make these massive investments in education? How do you make these investments in making sure people can manage this transition and still keep a low tax base?
There's something called the private sector. I mean, you're assuming that education is done by government. And I think
I was unfairly assuming that. That's true.
See, I think Andrew also has the point. You know, if you emphasize local government and execution at the city level, you've got to worry about that whole fiscal chain. You know, that whole fiscal responsibility. And your point, you know, if you want free trade and no duties, and then you want to reduce taxes, what happens to tax revenue? I mean, how do you make the fiscal responsibility work? So I think you've got to solve that financing issue, which is a whole problem. But I think the thinking has to be that way, though. You know, I think you know, I want to answer this question that you posed. You know, since you started stepping on toes, Andrew, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to step on more toes. You know, I used to teach MBA program, right? But now I'm advising young people, if you have 2 years to spend after graduation to improve yourself, I'm not so sure I would spend it on an MBA. I think I would take chunks, maybe 6-month chunks in different part of your career to get totally re-educated. You know, and I think this goes against all the norms, the way the universities are set up, the way the MBA programs are set up. I think the MBA programs will be under a lot of pressure. You know, and also it goes against the norms of society, especially in Asia, where everybody needs a sheepskin. So I think, but you've got to kind of break those norms in order to really think openly about what the need is.
Andrew, could you jump in here?
Yeah, you know, on this education issue, you know, would like to have good debate with Marc on this area. My view is that the role of the government in education is overdone. And we've forgotten that it's become central planning in which the state dictates what the textbook should contain, et cetera, et cetera. What we forgot is that education was always part of society, part of the community, and fits the market needs. So we are producing jobless graduates. You know? And the reason why they're jobless graduates is because the business has no input into the curricula, and the community says, oh, let's just let the government take care of this, you know, you appoint whatever teacher you want, and the result is the bureaucracy, the curricula, etc., doesn't fit.
I disagree that business has had no input into their curriculum.
No.
You may be familiar with Trump University,
true.
Which was an astonishing success in the real estate market. Look, I think you know, this is being experimented on in the United States to see how this will work out. I think, you know, to some degree, you see even worse jobless rates coming out of the private universities in the United States than you do out of the sort of business-oriented, a lot of them are private, business-oriented universities, you know, University of Phoenix, Trump University, and that sort of thing. I think that there are certain valuable models where there's, you know, market intervention possible, and I think it does improve educational outcomes. But yeah, I think I'm just going to be a continuing skeptic that you know, businesses which have shifting norms and shifting priorities. I mean, you know, the model I think you propose, you know, involves, you know, sort of reinventing education every couple of years, which, you know, maybe that would work, but we also just don't even know what the future is going to look like. So I guess I would consider myself still a skeptic on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Should we? Do you have last comment on that, or?
Yeah. No. I just want to comment about this fiscal side.
Yes,
how are you going to pay for this? How have we paid for this? The biggest. Did you realize that credit card loans is now lower than student loans in the United States? Do you realize that in Asia, the household debt, a lot of it is actually student loans? And then if the graduates become unemployed 6 months or more, right? Unemployment in Asian youth after they graduate the chances are 50% first 6 months unemployed, and maybe 25% 1 year unemployed. Okay? And the reason is that it's just that the education quality. If you ask the local company to hire, if I've got an overseas graduate, I hire an overseas graduate, I'm not going to hire a local graduate. And who's going to be the voters? The local graduates. So this mistrust now in the education system itself, and the abuse that, if you borrow to pay this, you will be able to pay this back, is gone. And so I think the need to rethink education and the way it's funded, not by lending money or creating debt or, government debt replacing student debt. That's not the way to go.
We've covered a lot of topics up here, and we've veered a little bit from our central theme, which is what price populism, but I think education is such a key part of that. We can take any questions that you all have now, so please, I see the first hand up there in the back. Are there some microphones who can go, or you can just stand up and shout? Here comes a microphone, I think.
Hi, Dante Paradiso. I just had one thought on jobs as a central driver. I'm not entirely sure that that's quite the most accurate way to characterize it when we're talking about globalization. I think I would just offer for comment that maybe income, which gives you access to higher quality life, income is sort of the key concept. And tied to that is allocation of resources, who controls that, and access to capital. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any comment on that. And thank you all for the very, very good insights so far.
Okay. We've heard that job creation was the key factor, but he's asking, well, isn't it more important to just have income, rising levels of income and access to capital?
Well, my immediate reaction is actually to think about the opioid crisis in the United States and the associated deaths of despair, what they're calling them, which has reduced the lifespan of white Americans. And the reason I think of it is because a lot of these guys, regardless of income, and the problem is focused among white men. White women are suffering as well. Regardless of income, they're sitting at home, watching television, whatever it is, they're alone. And one thing that I think is important to focus on is not just jobs, not just income, but sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and making sure that these folks are still included in a community and that they feel wanted. At the end of the day, the fertile soil for Trumpism is unemployed people who are isolated and on the internet. And if those folks had a more vibrant school to go to, or a reasonable community center, and friends that were within walking distance, these are all things that could avoid some of the problems. So I think you're right to be focusing on income, but we need to go even one step higher than that.
Any other thoughts?
Well, access to capital. I think you're right. It's no longer on the balance sheet jobs, okay? It's about off-balance sheet jobs. That means, work that, more and more people are part of the gig economy, sharing, etc. But the issue about the access to capital is going to be fundamental to this. And I'm going to make something extremely controversial because a very important part of my life was a securities regulator. And guess what? Capital markets are very elitist. How many listed companies are there in the world? 50,000. How many SMEs are there in the world? In the hundreds of millions. And why is it the SMEs can't access capital and the securities regulators are only just beginning to look at crowdfunding? Doesn't make sense. So, the part of that populist revolt is, I can't even get loans, I can't even get access to capital, and you're still how to protect the big boys. And the listed companies, the first thing they announce when they have any problems, cut labor, cut jobs. So company A says, I'm going to cut how many labor, company B says, company labor, and so the man in the street is saying, hey, they're cutting my jobs. And so basically, the whole elitist, I'm sorry to say this, the rhetoric has been you know, technology is great. Yes, it's a consumer surplus, but it's a job deficit. And if that rhetoric gets accepted by the populists, revolution is going to really occur.
Interesting. Questions? We got a bunch here. We'll take one there and then one there. Okay, first one here. Yeah. Then you'll be the second one, though.
How much has central banks had to do with this in terms of the rising populism, and that your income can be stable and your cost of shoes and suits are cheaper, but the cost of education has skyrocketed, the cost of healthcare has skyrocketed, the cost of housing has skyrocketed. It doesn't seem that inflation has done this, because I see that, you know, with healthcare and education, that was a big reason that Bernie Sanders drew so many people on his side. Are the central bankers culpable at all in this case?
Central banks culpable in this because costs are going up, education, healthcare, et cetera. So basically people can't save money because they're going into a hole. What responsibility do central banks have? You were a central banker.
As a former central banker, mea culpa, you know, the central banks can actually claim that it was the failed politics that drove them into the breach. That's an excuse, but they have then created the world's greatest printing of money that has caused the greatest boom in history, and that has fueled the populist discontent. So if the qualification for being a central banker is joining one particular firm in Wall Street, are you surprised that the elitists are, the populists are very angry?
Did you have a comment on that, Marc? Or?
I mean, yeah, I think all of this institutional failure and elites being blamed, you know, are just sort of symptomatic of something that a colleague with my fellows program said to me a while back, which is that it's very easy to manage growth, it's very difficult to manage decline, and so you can sort of nitpick different institutions that may be responsible for this and that thing, but at the end of the day, if your economy is not growing, or if it's growing by, you know, 1% a year or whatever, you're going to struggle with a lot of these issues in a way that someplace that's growing at 6.5% or 8% would not be struggling. So, I mean, it's right to identify the issues, I think, but you know, and systemically speaking, it's going to be a lot harder to accomplish the goals that we want to accomplish in a low growth universe.
Okay, that's how countries got wealthier in the past, but what do we do for the future? Manufacturing is how countries, you know, South Korea, et cetera, built up their economies, but manufacturing jobs, we're now saying, will not create the jobs that they did in the past. Is that, how do we get past that trap?
Yeah, well, I think we should not think about manufacturing jobs in the traditional sense of people working in a large factory environment. I think production has to take place. I'm quite convinced the new economy has created the need for more production. But is it going to be satisfied in the way traditional manufacturing is structured? So I think you've got to really think through how the production will take place. It will be taking place somewhat in the traditional manufacturing plant, so to speak, but it has to be a totally different world. It has to be going through, you know, it can't say I want to do 1 million pieces of style and have long production runs, which is the way the world has set up traditionally. It's sort of been driven that way. We've got to set up factories that could do, you know, 10 line changes in an hour and do very short, low MOQs, we call it, minimum order quantities. We got to do 100 pieces of style and keep on changing. So the whole complexion of the manufacturing has to change. And a lot of this now could actually be done in much smaller and more flexible factories, and indeed in the homes. You see new models in which things are subcontracted, you know, really into the communities and into the home, if you would, the Uberized version of manufacturing. And that's the way I think we should still start to think about it. Sure. I'm quite convinced that the total amount of stuff that's needed to be produced actually will be increasing. And the challenge is actually becoming more and more complex because the consumer is requiring individual, personalized things. So you're creating more and more styles, if you would, more and more different things. And so it's a more complex manufacturing issue. And the job opportunities are actually vast. But how do you switch from the old system to the new is the challenge.
Andrew.
I think that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. The manufacturing jobs has been great for creating job creation. But people forget this. What has happened in the middle-income countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, is that jobs have been created and filled from manufacturing, but by importing labor. And that is true also in the Middle East. And guess what? If there are further problems in the oil-producing countries and all the migrant labor returns, what is going to happen to the job situation in the labor exporting countries? It's going to be huge, right? I mean, we worry about 10% of the migrants in the world, 10% are refugees, but actually 90% are economic migrants. And if the jobs in the so-called countries, because of populism and anti-immigration, starts and the world slows down, which although I think Mike is correct, but in emerging markets, the position is serious, dead serious, because of the demographic pressure, right? In emerging markets, what is it? 40% are actually below the age of 18, many emerging markets. And the Arab Spring was because of demographics, rising youth coming into markets, and I'm sorry to say, incompetent governments and incompetent policies. So we are actually having even more serious problems if you think about this issue. So what do you think the middle-income countries in Asia will do, those who are part of the global supply chain? They're going to go up the technology curve even faster, keeping the jobs for their own people, which means push out the migrants, which means the problem will be transferred to the former labor exporting countries, which already have very fragile governments, and therefore could be in the tipping point towards failing.
Can we try to get in maybe 2 or 3 more questions? I see a hand in the back there. Just stand up so she can give you a mic. Is there a microphone?
I'm Australian, so I'm really loud.
He's Australian, he's loud, but we'll save your lungs.
Thanks very much to all the speakers. I have a question. There seems to be a sort of missing step here, which is that we're talking a lot about jobs, and then we're also talking a lot about populism. People who are populist also have jobs sometimes. And I mean, one of the issues is actually about the disparity of wages and income and the types of jobs that we have. I was just wondering if the panel, particularly given Victor's comments about what manufacturing is going to be going forward, how do you see this, or Andrew's comments about startups? Isn't this just going to lead to more populism? And by focusing, therefore, on jobs, are we missing what's going to actually drive what we're talking about, which is populism and its costs, and sometimes, as Marc said, its benefits? Thanks.
Okay. I think if I understood the first part of that, it's not just about jobs, because a lot of people have jobs, but they're worried that their income hasn't gone up, their wages aren't going up, or it's not the kind of job that they really want, is it?
Well, I think it goes back to the hierarchy of needs. I don't, I think the focus is on jobs, but that's kind of the first layer. I think you've got to take care of the economic needs, but that is necessary but not sufficient. So you've got to really go up in the hierarchy of needs. And I think what you really, first of all, have to ensure that I have my job, that I can keep, continue to be able to support myself, and that my job would not be obliterated by technology or whatever, and then there's some security in the job. But then after that, I think I would like to look at, how am I doing relative to my neighbor, right? And what other things that I could be thinking about. So I think the whole move, that I think would really, in the very long run, that's the base of your question. How do you reconcile this? What is the real solution to populism? Just getting the jobs done doesn't really solve it completely, but I think it's the first step. It's a necessary condition. But then the sufficient condition, I think, is really to change the way we're thinking about jobs altogether today. I think we need to think out of the box in terms of traditional manufacturing, the way even service jobs are being executed in the economy. You know, I think you're going to hear from our speakers later on that the development of AI would probably obliterate any service job that's earning less than 30,000 US, you know, in the developed economies per year. So you've got to really think through the nature of the jobs, and then how we, going back to your question, how do we teach people to create their own jobs? Which I think is entirely open and possible in today's, you know, sort of really technologically enabled world.
Did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The link between the jobs and populism is a guy in England who coined the term precariat. The proletariat that is in a precarious job that doesn't earn enough. And so they're working harder than ever in the United States. They're angrier than ever. And that is reflected in their, you know, populist drive. So in Asia, we have our own precariats, but in different categories. But it's very clear that this is the political issue.
We are almost out. I see one hand waving over here.
Quick question. Now, the media has played a central and critical role. I mean, the social media has played a critical role in promoting populism for good, and it seems to be mostly for the worse. So can I have the panel's comment on this?
But the panel's comment on the role of social media here. I'm going to pass it along. By the way, I was really glad that that question came up because we had an all-male panel and all-male questions. So I wanted the last question to be from a female. The role of social media and the digital world. You spoke about this a little bit, I think, in your comments as well. I'm going to dodge that one.
Yeah, I mean, social media has obviously facilitated people's seclusion in their own information universes, and that's, you know, been greatly problematic. One of the things that I think is maybe happening is that as all these elite institutions are losing the trust of the public, that social media might eventually lose the trust too. You know, people don't necessarily like, you know, being handed fake news. So I think it's entirely possible that social media might fall victim to that same dynamic. You know, that's yet to be seen. But one of the things that I think is really interesting from a sort of political perspective, having done campaigns, was that, you know, at least as of 2012, and to some degree to 2016, the going wisdom was that we had so much information from all different media that the one way that voters sorted the correct information from the bad information was via their friends and family, and Facebook and Twitter and all these, I guess, serves as a sort of proxy for that, and that's what has made it, you know, so powerful. But we may very well be, and I'm hoping we are, at a failure point for that, where the propagation of nonsense is not going to be long-term sustainable. You know, in Congress right now, they're looking at how to resolve this problem via state means. I'm not sure that they're going to come up with a good way of going about it, but then, you know, the market may speak too. I can just speak personally. I don't go on Facebook anymore at all, not just because of the fake news and the cookie tracking, but because of the anti-Semites that I've encountered on there. And you know, it's vicious stuff that, like, you know, with repeat exposure is just really unpleasant. So I don't know. I'm cautiously hopeful that the social media populist foment has reached its peak and will decline. And the other thing to keep in mind is state intervention from Russia. You know, that this was you know, an attack, and it's an attack on Europe. It's an attack on you know, parts of the world where popular elections are vulnerable to populist waves. So.
Victor, do you want to have the last word?
No, well, I'm not so sure about the last word, I think. But I think this is a very important issue. It's an important issue not only in the context of the impact of social media on the things that you mentioned, Marc, but it's a very important issue in the world of commerce and the rise of e-commerce vis-a-vis the old brick-and-mortar economy, et cetera. I think what we've come to realize is the web is not an unmitigated, you know, sort of good, and it's not nirvana. when it first came out, whoa, this is going to solve the problems of the world. Everybody's going to live very happily ever after. And we're really at a tipping point where we need to look at whether this, in all respects, you know, in the social, in the commercial, etc., is it going to correct itself? Is the system going to correct itself and actually bring it into something that really would do public good, social good? Or governments will have to step in. I think we're really at that juncture. And you talk about the role of government. I think one of the key roles is looking at the proper role that this whole web and the social media, etc., should play and could play. And I think it, you know, government intervention could be very heavy-handed in the wrong way, or it could be actually guiding the system back to a development, which is, I think, a lot healthier. And we're really at that critical juncture. I think we may have to, I think the government may have to do both. It has to cut off and prevent certain types of behavior. You talked all the things about in the social realm. You know, in the other realm, you've got to really think about predatory pricing, for example. And how do you drive people out of business by, frankly, fairly unfair competition sometimes. So I think it's going to be a combination of cutting off the tails in terms of behavior and then setting the norms for a now proper further development of this system, which will be so much part of our lives.
Well, thank you. We're about 4 minutes over, and this panel is all that's standing between you and the coffee break. So I just want to have one last order of business, which is to give a round of applause to our guests, Andrew Sheng, Marc Levitt, and Victor Fung.